All right, so I show 10 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to our Welcome Spring Author Speaker Series. I'm Denise Ellsworth with the OSU Department of Entomology and Extension here in Ohio. Excited about today's session. We have lots and lots of folks registered and many others who will come back to watch the recording. We are recording all the sessions this week. Really excited about our lineup. We have 5 wonderful authors and they'll be featuring their books. You don't have to have read their book to enjoy the session, but we do have links on our series homepage that will get you information about the authors, about their books, and also we'll have the recordings once those are completed. My co-host, Julia Wilson from Chadwick Arboretum. Julia, thanks. It's always great to work with you on these webinar series. And then we have Marcia Karsten, who is facilitating this morning, helping out with questions and technical details. Marcia is Xerces ambassador and also is a volunteer pollinator specialist with OSU, so a special volunteer education and volunteer program that we offer. So I want to thank our funders this morning. We received a grant from the USDA. It's an IPM integrated pest management grant with a focus on pollinator health. So those funds help us bring our wonderful authors in. And we also have a grant from the Manitou Fund, who is supporting our pollinator outreach program. So many thanks to our funders. Julia, do you want to give us a hello from Chadwick Arboretum down in Columbus?
Yes, I do. Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be back here with Denise and Doug Tallamy, Marcia Karsten. It's so nice for another webinar series. And I do love co-hosting these with Denise because it gives me a chance to personally invite all of you to Chadwick Arboretum, which is on the Ohio State University campus in Columbus, Ohio. So for those of you outside of Columbus, Chadwick is a 62-acre public garden, and it really is a fantastic time to come visit. Things are really starting to wake up around here. We've got daffodils, winter aconite, the witch hazels are blooming, hellebores, the trees are starting to bud. It really is just beautiful right now. But if you are looking for another virtual way to visit our Arboretum, I'm seeing lots of people we've got one from Ontario, all over the United States. We have a new webinar series starting, and it is kicking off on Thursday evening. So it is a week of webinars, and I hope to see you all at all of them. But this Thursday evening is one I want to mention, especially to you tree lovers out there. At 6 p.m., we're going to be learning all about the trees that stay green all winter mostly, with a webinar about dwarf conifers for the home landscape. We're going to be featuring photos from our beautiful conifer collection, which is what you see behind me as well. So in the chat box, once we all kind of slow down on adding our cities and states, I'll put in the chat box this link to Chadwick Arboretum's website. So you guys can find all the information about our Tree University webinar series, about dwarf conifers, and all the other things that are going on and how to visit the Arboretum. So thank you all so much for coming and spending your Monday morning, and hopefully I'll see you all every day at 10 a.m. here.
Great, thanks, Julia. I wanted to mention another program out of the School of Natural Resources at OSU, and you can see Doug Tallamy will be one of the featured presenters. It's an evening program, is free, and I put the link up there. Also, we'll put it into the chat box, but another way to, the focus is on monarchs, so you can hear about all different efforts to help conserve this very threatened species. So April 21st from 6 to 7:15 Eastern, that Earth Day webinar series. So just a couple recaps about the Zoom system that we're using today. We do have the chat box, and as Julie said, once it's slowed down a little bit, we'll put some of those links in as they come up. We'll share those again at the end. We do have the Q&A box. You'll want to use Q&A for questions that will eventually field at the end for Doug. And you'll want to upvote on those questions because we're going to have more questions than we can get to. So if you see a question similar to, to one you have, upvote that question. That'll help it rise to the top. And we'll bring those questions up to Doug. Doug has lots of great content. And so the plan this morning is to go about 60 minutes with his content, and then we'll kind of formally end. If you need to hop out because you have something on the hour, that's fine. And then we'll take those questions. So I hate to cut Doug's time short. We have lots to learn about the nature of oaks, and I'm really excited about his presentation. So Doug Tallamy is a professor at the University of Delaware, also an author, biologist, researcher. You've probably read several of his books, Bringing Nature Home, which really transformed how many of us think about native plants several years ago. Nature's Best Hope out more recently, along with the effort to get us all to do what we can in our own backyards. I featured on the slide here the Homegrown National Park effort, and I'll put that website in. You can register your landscape to be part of this Homegrown National Park to help us all do what we can to conserve nature. And today he's going to be talking about the nature of oaks, his new book. I can't wait. Oaks are one of my favorite genus. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and Doug, turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Denise. There we go. I think we're ready. Okay, welcome everybody. I have good news and bad news. The good news is this is a brand new talk, and you're only the second group to hear it. The bad news is that this is a brand new talk, and so that means you're guinea pigs. This is a real downside of Zoom because, you build a good talk by looking at audience reaction. And the only audience in front of me right now is an ant on my wall, so I'm not getting a lot of reaction. So it's hard to figure out what's working and what's not. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. But I want to talk to you today about my new book, Nature of Oaks, and I'm going to follow what happens on the oaks in my yard for an entire year. And this is what our yard looked like when we moved in July of 2000. It was a part of a farm that was broken up, and it was mowed for hay. It was the last thing they did. So there were very few trees there. So in the fall, we walked down the street. There's a big white oak down the street, and got some acorns and planted them. This is the tree we're going to follow right here. White oaks germinate in the fall. They put out, looks like a taproot. It's really called a radicle. It goes straight down into the soil, but they don't put up new leaves until the following spring. And when they do, this is what it looks like. Now they grow, oaks have a reputation of growing very slowly. And that's because in the beginning, they're building a huge root system. In their first year, oaks grow 10 times more root biomass than leaf biomass. And some people get discouraged. Oh, I don't want to wait for an oak to grow. But there's my little oak. He's got his little deer cage around there. But a mere 18 years later, that tree, there it is right there, is 45 feet tall. It is 47-inch diameter at breast height, 30-foot spread for canopy. And of course, it's still a baby. So this is the tree we're going to follow. First, I want to talk about some of the facts surrounding oaks before we jump into it. I am focusing on oaks because they are such an important lifeline to so many different species of insects, fungus, all kinds of things, birds, rodents, bears, raccoons, possums, rat snakes, fenced lizards. There are a few butterflies that are specialists on oaks, not that many, but hundreds of species of moths, and plus their predators and their parasitoids. They're, of course, the hosts of cynipid gall wasps. We'll talk about them. A number of types of beetles, many spiders, and then the oak leaf litter creates a very healthy soil that has even more species beneath the soil than above the soil. But this highly diverse, probably the most diverse web of life associated with any tree in North America, it goes largely unnoticed and unappreciated, and that is why I wrote this book. I want you to look at the trees in your yard and see them as more than trees. It's an entire community of living things. And if you don't have a tree in your yard or an oak in your yard, put one in there, and then you can watch this community develop. First, a few facts. Oaks are in the genus Quercus, which contains, it's actually 91 species in North America, 435 species globally. Quercus comes from the Celtic quer, meaning fine, and ques, meaning tree. So oaks are fine trees, and they are indeed. There are 4 common sections, taxonomic sections in the genus in North America. The Quercus section, the white oak group, Lobate section, the red oak group, Verentes section, the live oak group, and then a much smaller group in the west called canyon oaks, Protobalanus. They have an extremely long life cycle. A very healthy oak can live up to 900 years. That's 300 years of growth, 300 years of stasis where they're not changing much, and then 300 years of decline. And they perform very important ecological roles during each one of those periods. They can be massive. This is a picture of the Y oak. It has fallen down at this point, but I was lucky enough to see it before it did fall down from Y, Maryland. But it was the largest white oak in the country, so they do get large. And they have superior ecological function. They have the highest biodiversity value. We'll talk about that. They're sequestering more carbon dioxide than almost any other type of tree, which of course in this day and age is a very important ecosystem service. They're stabilizing our soil extremely well because they've got such large root systems. They make the best leaf litter in that it lasts the longest and provides the most benefits that leaf litter develop or delivers. And in doing that, they promote very healthy watersheds. So we're going to start in October. There's nothing special about October except that is when I decided to write this book. So this is the tree as it stood in October when I started to write. October is of course when oaks are dropping most of their acorns. I say they make acorns, but they do that over the course of the year. And they make a lot of acorns. A single large oak can produce up to 3 million acorns throughout its life. So that is a lot of fuel that keeps an awful lot of creatures very happy. Rodents certainly depend on acorns. So do larger creatures like the black bear. Turkeys love acorns. A number of birds depend on acorns like the red-bellied woodpecker, titmice, towhees, white-breasted nuthatches, flickers. Squirrels, of course, are eating acorns all the time. You know that our cute deer eat acorns. A lot of ducks eat acorns, particularly wood ducks. They dive down. Any acorn that has fallen into the water, they gobble up, and they come up onto the land and eat a lot of acorns as well. And then there's a number of invertebrates that depend on acorns. This is the acorn weevil working its way out of a hole it's chewed in the acorn. There's a series of moths, very cryptic species in the genus Blastobassis that are called acorn moths, and they live in acorns as well. And because all those things are eating acorns, when you look under a tree after a while, this is what it looks like. All the acorns are eaten or destroyed. So you might wonder, well, how do oaks actually successfully reproduce if all of these creatures are eating the acorns? And this is where an ancient mutualism comes into play. It's a mutualism between jays and oaks that has arisen very old, way back in 65 million years ago in Southeast Asia when oaks evolved. Jays hooked up with them very early. And these are species of jays all over the world. And they get food from those acorns. That makes sense, but they also allow oaks to move. Oaks can move in terms of dispersal faster than any other tree on the planet, and jays get the credit for that. That's because jays store acorns for winter food. They grab an acorn, they fly. They don't cache them. They don't make a big pile of them like some other creatures do. They bury the acorns singly. So they'll pick up an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree, and then they tap that acorn below the surface of the soil. And of course, the object is that they're going to go back and get it in the wintertime. You know, jays are clever, sneaky little devils. So while they're burying their acorn, they look around very carefully, because if another jay is watching them, they'll wait a few minutes, then they'll pick up the acorn and move it to a different place, because they know that jay is going to come in and steal the acorn they just buried. Then during the wintertime, they're going to try to remember where they put all those acorns. They can bury up to 4,500 acorns each fall, but they only recover about 1 in 4. They just simply forget where they are. And of course, if the jay gets killed if it gets eaten by a Cooper's hawk or something. They don't recover any of those acorns, which means a single jay can plant 3,360 oak trees every single year. And that is how oaks move. November. Speaking of acorns, have you ever noticed that some years we have a whole lot of acorns and other years we have very few or none? That's called oak masting. 2 years ago, we had a big oak mast in the east. You probably remember it. I'm looking for an oak mast in the white oak group this year. I'm hoping. But the question is, why do oaks mast? Why don't they make a decent crop of acorns every single year, like a lot of other trees do? And there's 4 different hypotheses about why that might be: predator satiation, predator reduction, improved pollination, and energy partitioning. Predator satiation, there are specialists on acorns, like the acorn weevil, that's just one of them, that can build up in tremendous numbers. When you have a lot of acorn weevils around, they can essentially parasitize 90% or more of the acorns on an oak tree. Now, for things that eat acorns, that's not bad news, because then they get a lot of protein along with it, but it's not great news for the acorn itself. And if oaks produced a steady number of acorns every single year, the populations of acorn weevils and the acorn moth and all the other things that eat them would build up to the point where they could take advantage of just about every acorn that was produced. But if they are irregular in how they produce their acorns, so some years they produce very few, there would be very few acorn weevils, and then they produce a whole bunch, you'd be able to swamp the predator populations that are out there. By predators, I mean the things that eat acorns. And in that sense, you get some of those acorns through to germination. Predator reduction. During an oak mast, populations of squirrels and mice in particular explode because there's so much food around. They have very successful reproduction. Well, if the very next year there are very few acorns, then their populations crash. There's actually a lot of starvation going on, and that reduces the number of acorn predators that are out there, so that if they mass the following year or 2 or 3 years later, the number of things that are going to eat those acorns is far reduced. And again, that way they get some through. Improved pollination. This is another hypothesis that oaks, of course, are wind pollinated. And the idea is that if they're all putting out a lot of pollen in a single year, the chances of the pollen actually reaching the female flowers is much, much greater, because it's really up to the wind whether it's successful or not. And then finally, energy allocation. There's usually not enough energy for oaks to grow a lot and produce a lot of acorns in the same year. So they tend to divvy it up. Some years they grow and produce very few acorns. Other years they don't grow very much at all, but put all their energy into acorn production. And the important thing to realize is that those 4 hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. They all could be happening at the same time. All good explanations for why oaks mast. December. Have you ever noticed that some of our oaks, particularly in the white oak group, don't drop their leaves in the fall? And it's those leaves that are retained are particularly abundant on the lower branches of oaks, and it's usually not ancient oaks, but ones that are fairly young themselves. So why is that? Why are they holding their leaves when most other trees drop their leaves? It's a condition called marcescence. So there you go. They're holding a lot of leaves. Well, it turns out that, there are a number of hypotheses for this as well, but the one that I like the best has to do with the Pleistocene mammals that used to be very common here in North America, actually all over the world. These are the Pleistocene mammals that were in Mexico. 3 species of mammoths: the giant sloth, camels, elk, rhinoceroses, horses, all kinds of things, many of which were browsers. In other words, they were eating actually the tips of branches that have those meristematic tissues on there, the buds for next year. And they did a whole lot of browsing. Well, if you put leaves all around the buds on your young branches, it makes them unpalatable. It's hard for a browser to get to those buds without getting a mouthful of dead leaves. And if you look at the distribution of those dead leaves, it goes up about 18 feet before they stop. And that's the reach of the giant sloth and some of those mammoths. And beyond that, they don't hold the leaves. So it really does suggest that this was a mechanism for minimizing browsing. Another hypothesis is that you couldn't eat the tips of the branches without rustling those leaves. And of course, there were a lot of predators back then too. So it was hard to forage quietly when marcescens was around. And marcescens can, in terms of landscape value, it can provide a screen from a deciduous tree in the middle of the winter, which is a good value. Okay, January. January, of course, is the winter time. And if you spend any time out in the winter walking around, you may have noticed that there are a number of birds that are active, and they're active running around in the branches of trees that have no leaves on them. It looks like they're foraging for food. Things like the yellow-crowned kinglet. I took this picture when it was snowing out, and it's out there foraging on branches. Excuse me. So what are they foraging for? Yellow-crowned kinglets are interesting because they're tiny birds. They are insectivorous. They don't eat seeds at all. Yet they stay around in the wintertime, which means they're eating insects and spiders all winter long. Where are they finding them? And they're not alone. Chickadees, 50% of a chickadee's diet is seeds, but the other 50% is insects, and same with titmice. Well, Bern Heinrich, he's a professor emeritus at this point, but he writes the natural history column for Natural History magazine. You've probably seen his column. Years ago, he found out what kinglets are eating anyway. He took a look at what was in the crops and the stomachs of kinglets that had flown into windows in the middle of winter and killed themselves. And he found out they were full of caterpillars. They're getting caterpillars in January. A big surprise. Where are those caterpillars? They're sitting on the branches, and they look just like twigs, just like this one, or like this one. That is a caterpillar, believe it or not. That is a caterpillar there. There's one. When it gets real cold, they shrink a little bit. When it gets warmer, they swell up a little bit, but they just sit there all winter long. They're not eating. They're not doing anything. And that is what these birds are foraging on. So you might wonder, why do particularly oaks have a lot of caterpillars in the middle of the winter? Why don't they overwinter as an egg or a pupa like most other insects? It's a good question. But one reason could be that they are there ready to go when those new leaves pop out. That's a brand new resource. If they're an egg, they'd have to hatch, and then they're very tiny. But if you're a mid-size or fully grown caterpillar, you can really munch down, be the first one there when those new leaves appear. Could be a big advantage. February, this is the quietest time of year for oaks. So let's spend the time. Yeah, that's what February looks like in my yard. Let's spend the time talking about some of the myths associated with landscaping with oaks, and there's a number of them. One is that oaks are too expensive, that they grow way too slowly to use as a landscape plant. Then they get too big to use on small lots, certainly small lots, and even moderate-sized lots. They're going to fall over and crush our house, and if they don't, they'll lift up our sidewalk and wreck our driveway. So if they were all true, there'd be good reasons not to use oaks, but are they all true? Well, let's start at the beginning. Are oaks too expensive? Well, they are if you insist on instant gratification by planting a large oaks. But there are serious downsides to planting a large oak. Now, if you plant one that was grown in a pot, as you see here, and a lot of nurseries sell them that way, if you take the roots out of the pot, that's what they look like. They're root bound. Oaks have big root systems, remember, and they go round and around, they wrap around each other. And when they continue to grow outside of the pot, they end up strangling each other. So a root bound condition is typically fatal down the road, several years down the road. One of the reasons we think that, well, the oaks don't live that long, well, they just strangled themselves with the root bound roots that we created. The other option, of course, is a bald or burlap tree. It's a better option, but again, those roots have to be seriously trimmed in order to dig up and transplant the tree. And if you plant a tree like that, it will, if it doesn't die, and there's a 50% chance that it will sit there for up to a decade trying to rebuild its root system so that it can start growing again. In the meantime, if you had planted a very small tree or even an acorn, it'll have a very healthy root system and will grow and actually pass this big one that you just paid $3,000 for. So they can be expensive, but they don't have to be. As a matter of fact, they can be free. This is the size we want to focus on when we plant our oaks. And actually, this is a 2-year-old oak. You can see it's got a 2nd year growth here. So you can even the 1st year is a better way to go. Do oaks grow too slowly? Well, again, if they're root prune, they're going to grow real slowly for a long time. But if you don't root prune them, they grow pretty fast. I'm going to have a contest here between my little friend Bella and that oak that we planted in the front yard. It is now 6 years old. So here's Bella. She's 2 years old. This is what it looks like when it's 7 years old. Bella's tall for her age, by the way. So she ought to be able to grow faster than this very slow growing oak. 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old. Uh-oh, she's losing. 10 years old, 11 years old. The oak, 12 years old, 13 years old. She's really losing. 14 years old, 15 years old, 16 years old, 17 years old, 18 years old, 19 years old. And this was this year. So there she is with her mask on. I can't even get the oak in the frame anymore. Bella has lost. She has lost the race, although she is now considerably taller than me. So oaks don't grow that slowly. I mean, you give them a good root mass and they grow almost as fast as lots of other trees. The thing of it is, you don't need to have a large oak before it starts to contribute ecologically to your landscape. They contribute almost immediately. Here is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that oak. Why do we want caterpillars eating our oaks? Because caterpillars are transferring more food from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. And the more caterpillars you have in your yard, the more other life forms you have in your yard. In other words, the more biodiversity you have, which makes you your ecosystem much more stable, much more functional. So caterpillars are good things. They are not bad things. And oaks make more caterpillars than anything else, and they make them right away. Are oaks too large to use as small yards? Well, it's a judgment call, but I certainly can find lots of very small yards with large oaks. This is a yard near the University of Delaware, tiny little yard, and there's 2 very large red oaks that are there. They probably were planted the same year that this house was built, which makes them well over 100 years old. But they're shading the house. They're dropping the temperature in the house in the summertime by 10 degrees, protecting it from wind during the winter time. You can decide, by the way, look, they're not lifting up the sidewalk there at all. This is a very large oak in front of a large church, just to put it in perspective. But it's such a valuable tree here that they decided not to take it down. Point is that we don't have to use the giant oaks in small lots. There are a number of species of small oaks that we could use. More species in the West than in the East, but still a number of species that are options. Some of these actually are ground covers. Others are bush-like structures or small trees. Now in the East, the one that is already in the trade is dwarf chestnut oak, Quercus prinoides. Several of these others are not in the trade, but they should be. They could be. Oaks are easy to grow. We've got to get them in there so people have the option of using smaller oaks. This is what a dwarf chestnut oak looks like. They make acorns when they're 5 feet tall. This is one in my yard. Will oaks fall over and crush your house? Well, you hear about that all the time in the news. Our media are such now that we can hear any incident that happens anywhere, particularly if it's bad. We're sure to hear that anywhere in the country. And it makes it sound like every tree that's out there is falling on our houses. Well, they do fall down, particularly when you've had a lot of rain and a lot of wind at the same time. It loosens the soil and that wind pushes them over. So how do we avoid that? We avoid it by the way we plant them. We plant every single tree as if it's going to be a specimen tree, so it can gain its maximum size, no competition from anything else. But that is not the way trees typically grow in nature. They grow in a forest where the spacing is much closer, and the root system is interlocked. It forms a very stable matrix underground, and it makes it almost impossible to blow this tree grove over. You can see how interlocked roots become if you look at a stream cut where the soil has been washed away. This is 1, 2, 3, 4 different trees that you're not going to blow over one of those. A tornado might snap one off, but it's certainly not going to blow them over. So rather than this, let's think about this. Now, these are 2 white oaks that I'm sure were here when they put this road in, but that's on about a 8-foot center right there. Neither one is as big as it would be if it was isolated, but you can view them as an oak grove, and they are far more stable. This is called the Three Sisters in Northwest Connecticut. Again, growing close together, the roots are really locked in. They're not going to blow over. But you can intentionally create very attractive tree groves. This is one at Mount Cuba Center. It's a DuPont estate that focuses on native plants. So there's a big red oak back here, but then we've got hemlocks in the front and rhododendrons and other understory bushes down here on the ground. It is a planned, formal setting that it was planted back in the 30s, so this was a cornfield in the old days, so it is, it's part of a planned landscape, but it's a grove, and you don't view any one of those trees in isolation. You grow them, you view them as a community of trees that is beautiful, functional, and it has a lot of ecological integrity. Will your oak lift up your sidewalk? It will if you plant the wrong oak. If you plant a willow oak, for example, some oaks have very shallow roots, and willow oaks are one of them. If you plant that right next to a sidewalk or a street, it can lift it up. But other oaks, particularly in the red oak group, have much deeper root systems. And I show you a number of pictures here where large red oaks aren't touching the hardscape around it. Look at this. There's no uplift at all. So it's not a given that your big tree is going to wreck your hardscape. You just have to pick the right species. March. Okay, the leaves are finally starting to drop now. So Marcescence is ending. That gives us an opportunity to talk about leaf litter itself. I mentioned that oaks produce wonderful leaf litter. They do that because those leaves are filled with tannins and filled with lignans that make them they're hard to digest for bacteria and fungi. They're difficult for many things to eat, which means they last a long time. And that's the major function of leaf litter. It is something that protects the soil community from drying out. So it keeps it moist, it protects the soil from erosion, and there's all kinds of creatures that live in healthy leaf litter and the soil underneath it. There are more species of animals that live in the soil than on top of the soil, believe it or not. We don't appreciate them because we can't see them. But in a single square meter of soil, there can be 250,000 mites. There can be 100,000 springtails. This is a little collembolan, a sminthurid collembolan, one of the springtails. 90,000 proturans, which are really small. They're primitive insects. You can see them much more easily with a microscope, and up to 1 million nematodes. And this is all in a single square meter. So a lot of life down there. But when the soil dries out, it all disappears. It's leaf litter that provides the nutrients for them, the organic material that keeps them going, and also the moisture that allows them to live. There are also 70 species of moths. We call them litter moths that, as caterpillars, they eat dead leaves. This is one that's very common at my house, the ambiguous litter moth, or the dark spotted palthus. So if you walk along in the leaf litter in almost any time in the summertime, these things will fly up. They're very common, important parts of the food web. Then you've got a lot of arthropod predators, like carabid ground beetles, very common. They're running around the leaves and you're on the ground. And they're predators. They're eating other things. And I guess that's all we're going to say about leaf litter. But April is also the time that new leaves pop out. And it's your chance to witness one of the most ephemeral interactions that occurs in all of nature. You've got about 5 minutes a year to catch this. And I was lucky enough to actually do it. I'm talking about when cynipid gall wasps come out and actually lay their eggs in the buds of oak trees. It's just a very brief window. I remember the day that this happened. I was sitting inside and I said, I bet the cynipids might be out now. I walked outside and bingo, there they were. 10 minutes later, they're gone. So this is a female cynipid gall wasp. This is a male riding her, hoping to mate with her after she lays one set of eggs in here. Here's another male who's he's not the winner right now, but he's standing by just in case. So what are gall wasps doing? The female, in this case, is laying an egg in the meristematic tissue of an oak bud. Meristematic tissue is undifferentiated cells that will grow up into a new branch eventually. But along with the egg that she's laying in there are hormones. She injects plant hormones into those undifferentiated cells, and those hormones manipulate how those cells are going to grow. People liken it to a cancerous growth, but it's actually under a lot of control by the cynipid wasp. There are 5,000 species of cynipid gallers on oaks worldwide. A single oak tree can support 70 species of gallers, and that, of course, is a gall. And when you have 70 species of gallers, you've got at least 70 types of galls, and it's even more complex than that because cynipids have what is known as alternation of generations, where one generation the gall looks like perhaps like this. Another generation, the second generation, the gall looks entirely different. The wasps that come out of it look entirely different, yet they're all the same species. So it's amazing that early taxonomists ever figured out that they were the same species. Most galls are hollow. This is the apple oak gall. If you cut it open, you'll see there's just a bunch of air in there with these little rays connecting a very hard protective mass in the middle, and it's inside there that the gall wasp is actually developing. So why in the heck do we have all of that space between the outside of the gall and the inside of the gall? And the answer is that that space is to protect the galler itself, the cynipid wasp, from its parasitoids, things like pterimid wasps that have very long ovipositors. For some reason, cynipid gallers host more species of parasitoids than any other type of insects. A parasitoid, by the way, is, we use the word parasitoid instead of parasite because a parasite does not kill its host. Think of a head louse or a tick. It feeds on you, but it doesn't kill you. A parasitoid does kill its host, and a single host is all that parasitoid needs. It doesn't kill a series of hosts. Otherwise, it would be a predator. So these are insect parasitoids, and they're laying eggs and developing in lots of other insects. But these pterimid wasps and many other types of parasitoids really focus on cynipids. And the distance between the cynipid galler and the outside of the gall has to be longer than the ovipositor, or the wasp can reach its prey. That's what evolution has done. It's separated the galler from the natural enemy. If you bring a gall inside and rear out what is inside that gall, chances are most of the time you're going to rear out the parasitoids of that cynipid wasp and not the galler itself. So what that does is it limits the time that the galler is vulnerable to the cynipid. They've got to hit it before that gall expands and separates them from their parasitoid. Gall variety is fantastic. I'll just give you a few pictures of a few galls that are common at my house. Some of them look like diseases, but they're not. Some of them look like pottery. This is the oak bullet gall. Some of them look like brains. They're very common. And then, of course, in the midsummer, the galler will complete its development and chew a hole and exit the gall. Then there's a second generation of gallers, which attacks the meristems that are about to explode in the second growth spurt of oaks. Oaks grow rapidly in the spring, but then if there's a decent amount of rain, they will have a second growth spurt in midsummer, usually not midsummer, maybe early July. And that's when the gallers will have their second generation. April's also the best time to find polyphemus cocoons on your oak trees. That was a polyphemus caterpillar. And this is what the cocoon looks like. When you have those marcescent leaves surrounding these cocoons, they're very difficult to find. But in April, the leaves start to fall, and you can find those cocoons pretty easily. And that, of course, is an adult polyphemus moth, which comes out of that cocoon, will lay an egg, and do it all over again. Okay, May. This is when the new biological year really kicks off. The oaks start to flower, the leaves burst forward, and it's no coincidence that's also the time we have spring bird migration. The migrants time their arrival in North America to coincide with the peak production of the food that they need, not just to sustain their migration, but also to allow them to reproduce. This is a magnolia warbler, one of the warblers that comes through at our house in our willow oak right here. This is a Blackburnian warbler and a red oak, again in my yard. If you're a birder, you know that you go to oak trees if you want to see warblers. Warblers, of course, are all insectivores. They're after those caterpillars that are in the trees. And just to show you that they really do love oaks, I'll give you a data set from one of my former students, Christy Beal, who looked at the amount of time warblers spend foraging during the spring migration in different plant families. So here's Fagaceae, that's where the oaks are. So in this case, Fagaceae includes oaks and beeches and chestnuts, but in her study, there were no beeches or chestnuts. So this is entirely oaks compared to other plant families here, the pines and the birches. Much more time in the oaks, of course, because they've got much more food. What are they after? They're after all the caterpillars that are in those trees. Things like the purple-crested slug, the buck moth, the white-marked tussock moth, the saddled prominent, the double-lined prominent, the white-dotted prominent, the checker fringe prominent, the laugher, the lace-cap caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the skiff moth, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the banded tussock moth, the hickory tussock moth, the red-lined panapoda, the yellow-neck caterpillar, the smaller parasa, the unicorn caterpillar, the crown slug, the pink-striped oakworm, the streaked dagger moth, the epilated dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the confused woodgrain, the spiny oak slug, and my favorite, the spun glass caterpillar. These are called slug moths, not because they're slugs, but because their head is tucked up underneath and you can't really see them from above. And many hundreds more species of moths are on oaks. So it's a great place to forage for food. It's like going to the store where the shelves are really stocked very well. That's where you'd want to shop. This is what our house looks like and will look like in a month or two from now. I'm sitting in this window right now, and I have been taking pictures of every species of moth that we've been able to attract to our property for the last 4 years. Again, those moths are what's driving the food web at our house. They're the measure of success in terms of restoring biodiversity. I'm up to 1,034 species of moths in my yard. 30% of them are found on oaks. So that's to give you an idea of how powerful oaks are, in terms of determining the biodiversity in our yard. Okay, June, at least this year, is going to be the year of cicadas. So this is the year that the periodical cicadas are going to emerge, at least in my house. I don't know if it's happening in Ohio. There's two broods. There's the 17-year brood and the 13-year brood. There's a place where they actually overlap, not far from where I live. But it has been 17 years since they emerged last at our house, and they're going to come out again in June, I hope. Unfortunately, every year the brood size gets smaller almost everywhere because of all the toxins we put in the soil and the trees that we cut down. But the media has already jumped on this. We're going to have a cicada emergence. It's going to be a terrible scourge, and we should all fear it. And what are we going to do? And terrible, terrible, terrible. That's just sensationalism. It's actually one of the most fantastic biological events you're ever going to have the privilege to witness. And this may be the last time I get to witness it. Who knows what's going to happen 17 years from now. So I am looking forward to it. This is what a cicada's skin looks like, of course, after they shed. It's called an exuvie. They crawl out of the ground as nymphs, shed this, emerge from this shell and become an adult. They have spent the last 17 years or 13 years, depending on where you are, feeding on tree roots, and they love to feed on oak roots. A single oak can host 20,000 cicada nymphs without any apparent ill effects. It's very difficult to measure a problem, and that is because the cicadas are feeding on the xylem, which is largely water. There's very few nutrients in xylem, which is one of the reasons they're growing so slowly. But, do they really have to stay underground 17 years? Obviously not if some are coming out in 13 years. And of course, we have the annual cicada, which is underground more than a year, but it's not 17 years. So why do they stay underground so long? And again, the answer seems to be predator satiation. There is no predator that can specialize on periodical cicada and then wait 17 years before they come again. Because they need to eat every year. And when they do come out, a lot of things are after them. All those chipmunks and squirrels and birds, everything is eating a cicada. But if they time their emergence to very odd years, well spaced apart, the populations of the predators that are available to eat them are much smaller than the number of cicadas that actually come out. So some of them will make it. They do lay their eggs in the terminal parts of branches and cause the act of egg laying actually kills the branch from that part out, and it's called flagging. So you get these little dead sections on your trees. Think of it as nature's pruners. People get very upset. Oh, look, they're killing my tree. They're actually just pruning them back a little bit. I would recommend, though, if you're planning on putting in some young trees that are quite small, wait until after June. So I'd say wait until the fall this year to put them in. And then you don't have to worry about it for another 17 years. But because they can't, you don't want them to be clobbering a tree that's only 2 feet tall. June is also when you might see a banded hair streak. They're one of the hair streak butterflies that do depend on oaks. Very few butterfly species use oaks, and I'm not sure why, but I suspect that the butterfly lineage, butterflies are actually day-flying, bad-tasting moths, and that lineage never got very good at being able to handle the defenses that oaks have, which are primarily tannins and lignans. But the hair streaks, there's some hair streaks that do develop on oaks. The banded hair streak is one of them, but don't try to find the caterpillars because they're actually eating dead leaves. They're one of the caterpillars that are in the leaf litter. I've never found one. They're there, but they're blending in, very hard to find. But the adult is not hard to find. They're up sitting on leaves. They come to flowers doing what hair streaks usually do. The interesting thing about hair streaks is that they appear to have the morphology of their wings looks like a second head, a false head. So this actually has 2 sets of antennae just to make it even more head-like, and structures that could be construed to be an eye. Here's the real head over here. So why is a butterfly trying to have 2 heads on its wings? Well, predators will try to make the kill by going for the head. And if the head is back here on wings, which are really dead structures, a bird could come and snap at the wing and break off part of it, and the butterfly could escape and live on to lay eggs another day. And that has always been the explanation. Well, they're trying to escape bird predation by misdirecting the fatal blow from birds. It's never been an entirely satisfactory explanation, though, because hair streaks are small. So first of all, they're not great targets for a lot of birds. They don't spend a lot of time flying around. They spend a lot of time sitting on vegetation. And when they're doing that, they're moving their wings up and down so that those antennae look like they're flicking up and down. They really do look like the living end is down here. But they're small. Are birds really watching all that? And if a bird does come, the first thing they do is fly off straight into the sun. So if the bird chases them into the sun, it's blinded by the sun and it can't find them. Well, Andrei Sarkov, not too long ago, realized that morphology of the wing, the false head, was actually directed at salticid jumping spiders and not at birds at all. These jumping spiders are predators as well, and they eat hair streaks. They sit on vegetation, and then they've got excellent eyes, and they jump, 8, 9, 10 inches and land straight on their prey and then eat it. Apparently the hair streaks are trying to misdirect that jump. So they're acting like their head is at their tail end. The salticid will jump and grab the wrong end of the butterfly, and the butterfly escapes. July. This is when the night chorus associated with oaks begins, probably mid-July, continues into August, and there's even a few stragglers that live on into September. But I'm talking about the katydids. Now, once upon a time, there was a young woman named Katy, and she fell in love with a handsome young man. Alas, he did not share her feelings, and he married another. Soon thereafter, he and his young bride were found poisoned in their bed. Who perpetrated the crime was never determined, but some say the insects in the trees were watching that night, and each summer they solved the mystery by singing katydid, katydid. So that is why katydids say katydid. We're really talking about males that lift their wings and rub their two wings back and forth. There's a raised structure here, two structures called a scraper and a file. We're talking about stridulation. They're moving the scraper and the file across each other, and they make that species-specific sound that we hear at night. It's the very same way that crickets make a sound. It can be quite loud. There are 4 species of katydids that frequent oak forests. They're always up in the canopy, so you don't see them too often until the fall when they get tired and come down. Some of them have spatula-shaped ovipositors. This is a last instar nymph. This is what it looks like when it's mature. And they lay eggs, large, very flat eggs. These have already hatched. They glue to the twig surface. So if you find eggs like this, now you know that they're katydid eggs. What's happening here is that the males are singing in order to attract females. And the females have to decide which male they're going to mate with. Well, katydids judge their male friends based on how loud their song is. Only a large katydid male can make a loud song, and large size indicates genetic success. So they're trying to find the male that is singing the loudest. August, very tough time for leaf chewers on oaks, but it's curious because it's the time when there's a lot of leaf chewers on oaks. Oak leaves get tougher as the season goes on. Again, they're filled with tannins and lignins, and they can become stiff like a board. I'm sure you have encountered that. So there's a couple ways that caterpillars can get around that leaf toughness. The most common way is to feed gregariously. Many of the species that feed on oaks in August the female will lay all their eggs in one place. They hatch out, and you've got dozens of caterpillars that are chewing together. So in this case, several mouths are better than a single one in breaking down that tough leaf tissue. This is the yellow neck caterpillar. Here it is as a larger caterpillar, but they still like to feed together. The orange humped oakworm, the pink striped oakworm, all of these guys are feeding gregariously. And of course, they can eat a lot of leaf material, and people say, "Oh, you got these caterpillars on my oak. I've got to kill them all." There were 115 yellow neck caterpillars on the lower branches of this tree just before I took this picture. And you can't see one of them, and you can't see their damage at all. So please ignore those caterpillars on your oak. They're performing really important roles in your ecosystem, providing food for the birds and lots of other things. Tammany Baumgarten of New Orleans recommends that we all follow the 10-step program when dealing with insect problems. Take 10 steps back from your tree and all your insect problems disappear. And that's exactly what happens here. The second way to approach tough leaves in August is to ignore the tough cuticle, the epidermis, the upper epidermis and the lower epidermis, and only eat the spongy mesophyll, the parenchymal cells inside between the two layers of leaves. Oak leaves are like a sandwich. and all the good stuff is in the middle here. I'm talking about leaf miners that are so small, so thin that they can feed between the epidermis, the upper and lower epidermis, and develop that way. It's a trade-off. It gives them very easy to digest leaf material, but it also keeps them very small. This is called the serpentine mine. So the egg is laid here, and then the first instar larva develops, and as it gets bigger and bigger, the mine gets wider and wider, but it kind of looks like a snake, so it's called the serpentine mine. The dark line in the middle here is all the frass that caterpillar deposited, and then it finished up and pupated here. This is called a blotch mine. It's a different approach. But they do all the feeding in just one circular little mask. And sometimes you can see the larva inside working away. That's what it looks like if it's extracted, and you take an excellent picture of it. Doesn't look much like a caterpillar at all, but these leaf miners are adapted to being very, very thin. When they emerge as an adult, though, they look like a regular moth. They're small, but they're often quite beautiful. This is the solitary oak leaf miner, the gregarious oak leaf miner, the oak tenniform leaf miner, a number of species of leaf miners on oak, because that's how they can get to that leaf material that's otherwise protected by leaf toughness. August is also a very dangerous time for oak caterpillars because the predator populations have built up to high numbers by that time. This is a eumenid wasp that has just stung a yellow striped oakworm. The oakworm is now stiff as a board. And this is a mechanism. She'll fly off to her little burrow and lay an egg on it, and then her larva will eat that caterpillar. So stinging and paralyzing a caterpillar is the same principle that we humans use a refrigerator for. You've got to keep your prey item from rotting before the larva, before your youngster actually eats it. And it can be a matter of weeks. So stinging and paralyzing it keeps it alive. It won't die, it won't rot. And then the wasp larva gets to eat it alive. Kind of gruesome, but it's very functional. This is an egg mass of the yellow neck caterpillar. So that's why they're gregarious. They lay all their eggs in the same place, but immediately, within minutes of the moth leaving, depositing those eggs, a parasitoid shows up. A tiny little egg parasitoid, probably an inserted wasp, is going to lay eggs into each one of these, or as many as she can. And here are other types of wasps emerging from the egg mass. And look at all the ones that were destroyed by those parasitoids. And these parasitoids are all over the place now. So they take a heavy toll on the caterpillars that are out there. Tachinid flies are another major group of parasitoids that are attacking all kinds of insects. This is a huge family of flies, thousands of species, and they all are laying eggs on other insects, but many of them are laying eggs on caterpillars. This is a saddleback caterpillar. Most people who encounter these caterpillars don't like it because they've got what we call urticating hairs. There's little poison sacs at the base of each one of these spines, and if it breaks off in your skin, it hurts. One of the limit-coated caterpillars that are protecting itself with these urticating spines. But look at this poor guy. He's dead 3 times over. This is a tachinid egg that hasn't hatched yet, but when it does, it'll burrow into his body. Come back here. This is a pteromalid wasp, which is laying eggs into the body of this caterpillar. This is a tachinid larva, which is already inside of it, and those are these spiracles. They breathe like anything else, so those spiracles are sticking out through the cuticle so that they can breathe. So again, 3 different parasitoids are killing this guy. He's never going to make it to adulthood. This is a contracted Daytana caterpillar that has tachinid eggs on it. This one's already hatched and tunneled into his head. Here's 3 more getting ready to go. So he's, again, the walking dead. But some caterpillars have gotten smart over evolutionary time. This is the black blotch caesura that has 3 permanent markings on its back that look just like tachinid eggs. So a tachinid fly comes along and says, "Oh, he's already parasitized. I'll leave him alone." Works very well. Another way to protect yourself from enemies is to, as soon as you feel the leaf vibrate at all, you drop down in a silken thread. You can't see the silken thread, but it's right here. And then you hang below the leaf that you were eating until the danger passes. Then you eat your way back up and get back to business. And if you walk under an oak tree at night, you see these guys hanging down quite frequently. So it just shows you the amount of enemy pressure that's out there. It's not entirely successful because there are parasitoids that have figured out how to actually reel in those caterpillars. Braconid wasps, for example, some species can hand over hand pull up the silk that the caterpillar is hanging from, and then lay an egg in that caterpillar. There are other species that actually shinny down, just like a fireman's pole, down the silken thread and lay an egg in the caterpillar that way. It's also the year, August is also the time of year that the plant hoppers become very common as adults. So both Flattidae and Acaneloniidae are two families of plant hoppers that can be very common on oaks. And they're nymphs. The immature stages are strange looking creatures. You can obviously see that's the head, but there's the abdomen. And then they've got this flocculent wax coming out the rear end. That's a protected device. Ants, for example, don't like wax. So if they approach from the rear, they get a mouthful of wax and it protects them. But they can be quite numerous, and it upsets some people. I get calls all the time saying, what are all these bugs on my trees? Well, they're Acaneloniids or flattids. And they can be numerous, but they're really not hurting anything. They're sucking I guess they're sucking phloem. People don't like the flocculent wax, but just as part of the fauna that ought to be associated with your plants. So again, something to celebrate. September, almost done with the year here. This is the peak period of cricket activity. Now, most people think of crickets as those black insects on the ground that sing at night, and many crickets are. But there's also a group of crickets called tree or bush crickets that are up in vegetation singing. They're typically green, sometimes they're brown. And they're doing exactly the same thing that those katydids are doing. The males are trying to attract the females by singing loudly. But these cricket males are very clever. They want to use acoustic baffles in their environment to exaggerate their sound. So what they do is they crawl around and find a hole in a leaf. There's some species that will actually chew a hole to their dimensions that work really well. Then they stick their head through that hole and raise their wings and sing right into the hole. Now this leaf will be convex. So this kind of acts like a parabolic magnifier and magnifying the sound of that male cricket. And then the female says, wow, he's a big guy, even though he may not be, and she'll come and mate with him. Something else you can see right in your yard. I took this picture right outside my back porch. It's also the month that you're most likely to see walking sticks. Walking sticks can be pretty common in oak trees. This is one I took in Arizona on the emery oak. But they spend most of the time in the canopy. You don't see them a lot. Sometimes in the fall, they get tired and come down. You see them on the ground. But most of the time, they're not common at all. But there are records of walking sticks being so common, particularly in maybe even Ohio, but I think of West Virginia, where they've actually caused defoliation at times. I've never seen that, but they're very strange. I mean, they're called walking sticks because they look like they're sticks that are walking in the group Phasmidae. Okay, we've gone through the year. I want to end by telling you what you already know, and that is we've got a serious biodiversity crisis. We're killing our birds. We've lost 3 billion of our North American birds in the last 50 years. We're killing our insects. We've got global insect decline. I don't want to say birds are disappearing. They're not disappearing. We're killing them. I mean, this is an active process here. And the Earth is now experiencing its 6th great extinction event. Only this is the only extinction event that has been caused by an animal, us. So it's a global crisis, but there is a solution, and it's a grassroots solution. If you and me, if we all together act by changing the way we treat our landscapes, we can turn much of these terrible headlines around. There are 4 things that every single landscape should be doing today. We've got way too much carbon in the air, so we want to pull it out of the air. Plants do that. better than anything else. A third of the carbon that's in our atmosphere right now is from us chopping down our forests and removing plants on the planet. So we want to put plants in the yard that are going to capture carbon and pump it into the ground. We want to put plants that are going to manage our watershed. Every watershed should be managed properly, or where you have floods and pollution and all kinds of nasty things. We want to support a diverse community of pollinators, because pollinators are essential. They're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Not just agriculture, all the plants. And we want to finally support a complex food web that supports all the animals that are running the ecosystems that we all depend on. Well, if you plant an oak, you're addressing 3 of those 4 goals in your landscape. You're capturing carbon better than any other tree. You're managing a watershed better than any other tree. You're supporting a more complex food web better than any other tree genus. The only thing we're not doing real well is supporting a diverse community of pollinators, because oaks, of course, are wind pollinated. Although there is increasing evidence that a number of spring pollinators do go to oak catkins, eat the pollen. They don't spread it to the female flower, so they're not actually pollinating, but they are using the pollen as a resource. The problem today, though, is that despite all their landscape attributes, oaks are in trouble. The old giants are gone. Their forests used to be filled with oaks that were hundreds and hundreds of years old. Now we think that a 100-year-old oak is an old one. It's still a baby. The percentage of oaks in our eastern forests has been cut in half in the last century. 28 of the 91 North American oak species are now threatened. A third of the global oaks are endangered. So more than threatened, they're endangered. The Oregon white oak, for example, Quercus garryana, I think it is, has lost 97% of its range. I shouldn't say has lost. We have reduced its range by 97%. These are direct functions of the way we've treated these things. In Great Britain, the oaks are disappearing, and there are 2,300 species that rely on oaks in the British Isles that are now threatened because of the loss of oaks. And you probably read recently, they're going to replace the big beams in the Notre Dame Cathedral with, I think it's 1,000 or 3,000 oaks from France. Taking the last of the big guys and wiping them out. Well, we humans live out our lives during a very brief instant of ecological time. I mean, we're not here very long. So any one of us as individuals can't return the ancient oaks to our landscape during that instant of time, but we can start the process. And I really hope we do start the process. In a blink of ecological time, our oaks that we plant today will be large enough to assume their full keystone positions in our yards. But that's only going to happen if we plant them. Thank you very much. And I do want to encourage you, if you want to become a member of Homegrown National Park, where oaks will be featured in your landscape, go to our new website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. Become part of this national effort to convert lawn to functional ecosystem. So
great, thank you, Doug.
I'm really done.
It's such a great program. Always, we love your Tallamy wraps. We look forward to that being in there. Your great quick list of species. Your focus on biodiversity and giving us action steps that we can all take. And always comes up, how do you see all these creatures in your yard?
Experience. It boils down to experience. I know where they're supposed to be. I know when to look. If you're talking about caterpillars, the best time to look for caterpillars is not the springtime, because the birds have gotten them all then. That's the hardest time to find caterpillars. I would look at the end of July, early August, because the birds have then moved on to carbohydrates. At that point, most of the nesting is done and the caterpillar populations start to build. Looking for caterpillars at night is much more productive than during the day. They're hiding from the birds during the day. They will crawl off the leaves or onto the bark or the twigs, and they're all cryptic. They're blending in as well as they can, and they're very, very good at it. But knowing what they look like and where to look is a big part of it. Some of it is timing. Like seeing the Cynipid wasp, really, I've been trying to do that for about 30 years. And finally, I just plain got lucky. I know that they're out there in the spring, and I just happened to get lucky. So luck is involved. I don't know what other creatures I'm seeing, but
Great. So a general question is a lot. I know it probably all can't be in the book, but is a lot of this information in the book? And when do you know when it's going to be on shelves?
Actually, there's a lot more information in the book. I couldn't cover, just a little bit of it here in this talk. It's supposed to be released March 30th. So next week, I guess.
Wonderful. And folks, if you do have to hop off, we will be recording our Q&A section, so you can access the recording to find out the answers to. Doug, we had lots and lots of questions. Let's talk about leaves and how to manage leaves in landscapes. Some of the questions were about how deep of a layer can be left. Should the leaves be left whole or composted or chipped? When could they be reduced in size, etc.?
Okay, well, there's two reasons we're retaining our leaves, and that's because there's a lot of life in those leaves, and because the leaves are necessary ground covers, and the leaves are recycling the nutrients that your trees use that year. So the water. The best practices for watershed management now is to keep all the water that falls on your property. Same thing for leaves. You want to keep all the leaves that fall on your property, because those are going to break down and return the nutrients to the soil on your property. If you bag them up and ship them out, you're degrading the nutrient level of your soil every year. Should you chip them? Well, if you chip them, you're chipping up all the pupae and everything else that is in those leaves. So you've knocked out one of the benefits of those leaves. You're also shortening the lifespan of those leaves as leaf litter. They break down much faster when they've been ground up into powder. I know they don't blow away as easily, and they're prettier when they're mulched, and that's why people do it. But there are downsides to it that you should be aware of. My son bought a new house a couple of years ago, and he called me up in the fall, and he said, "Dad, I've got too many leaves. What should I do with the leaves?" I said, "Rake them into your flower beds." He said, "I don't have enough flower beds." I said, "Exactly. That's where you put your leaves, and that's how you shrink your lawn. We're trying to reduce the area that's in lawn, so create bigger flower beds. And the best way to start a new bed, which should be under your tree, is to, put leaves all around it. It'll kill the grass that are there, and then you can plant right through that. So you have an instant flower bed simply by raking the leaves to that part, and you've reduced your lawn. You can't leave the leaves on the lawn that you're going to keep, because they can't do that for grass. So I would suggest gentle raking, as opposed to I guess leaf blowing would work, but leaf blowing is so loud and obnoxious. You want to treat the leaves as if there are things that are living in there, because there are. And if you can find a place in your back where you can put more leaves that you don't want in your front, that's fine. If you pile them up several inches thick, you will depress the growth of any spring ephemerals or something else underneath there. So try to keep them at the thickness you would see in a regular forest floor, which would be maybe 2 or 3 inches. And then any perennials that you have in your beds will grow right through them. I've actually got a picture series going right now where I'm following perennials. They're covered with leaves right now, but they're going to pop up. The phlox and all the other spring ephemerals do quite well. You don't have to rake every single leaf off there.
Okay, speaking of spring ephemerals, there were a couple questions related to what you can plant that will grow well under oaks. And I know we have folks from several different states, so maybe some general recommendations how to decide what to plant under that canopy.
Okay, generally, it depends on the quality of the soil. So white oaks, for example, and chestnut oaks can grow on very thin soil, very thin rocky soil, and there's not a whole lot to work with. So that would determine what could make it under your oak. A lot of oaks will create acidity. So things like azaleas would naturally do well under an oak tree. But there are oaks, particularly in Ohio, that do quite well in basic soil too. So that's not a given. It's really, you're talking about the depth of the soil that you have, the size of your tree, the amount of rainfall that's going to get through there. Spring ephemerals will leaf out and do most of their living and be happiest in the early spring before the leaves even emerge. Oak leaves emerge later than most of other trees. So you get a lot of light coming through an oak. So spring ephemerals are great under there. I don't know, lost my train of thought. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Great. I'll jump in and give you another question. So this one I'm going to kind of read. This actually got the most upvotes. So it says, Dr. Tallamy, I once found a recommendation from you about planting a certain number of trees and shrubs per half acre, including more of the dominant species for your eco niche, but I can't find it again. So does that ring a bell? And is that something that you can refer to or that we can post on the website?
Mm. Oh, yeah, I think I remember that. I don't say that anymore. It's, I was trying to create a formula that people could follow, but there's too many variables. So it's probably not good advice. It depends on the size of your property. It depends on the size of the trees. It depends on the soil quality, the amount of rainfall. And I said that before. I also recognized how important the concept of keystone plants is. And that is that there's just 5% of our native plants supporting 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillar food. So they become essential parts of the plantings in your yard. If you're building, I think of a landscape as building an ecological house, and the keystone plants are the 2x4s of that house. So they're essential. They're not a completed house. You need other things, but you can't build your house out of wallpaper or it's going to fall down. So you need those keystone plants, and oaks are the best keystone plant that there is. And then you diversify with other things. Keep in mind that your plants grow. I mean, I have learned that here at home. you plant, you typically overplant. I'm now actually heating the house in the wintertime with trees that I planted when we moved in because I overplanted so much, and we're losing our sun because everything's grown so much. So picture your tree 20, 30, 40 years from the time you plant it and say, okay, do I have enough space for it? Which means you're going to probably have fewer plants initially than you would think. You don't want, a lot of people try to create that finished landscape look on year one by putting everything so densely together, and it doesn't allow for growth. So I don't have that formula recognized anymore, and you shouldn't put it on your website.
Okay. What I will post though, Doug, is I have your nice table of those keystone species. So I will post that, folks, on our website, so you can easily refer to that. It's a great list of, and it works for, I work mostly with pollinator plants. So most of those keystone species are also excellent for pollinators. So kind of a one-stop shop.
And I will say, it has nothing to do with oaks, but the National Wildlife Federation is getting ready to put up a new website about keystone pollinator plants for every ecoregion in the country. So it'll go beyond what you have. It'll be very good.
Great. Wonderful. So Amy asks, is it possible to transplant a tiny oak and have it survive, or is it too difficult because of the taproot?
Well, it depends on what you mean by tiny. If that oak is 4 or 5 years old, it may still only be 2 feet tall if it hasn't gotten a lot of light, but its root system will be quite large. Yes, it's possible to transplant it and have it survive, but you probably will have to root prune it a lot. So if I'm moving an oak from a flower bed that's germinated, if it gets beyond year 2, I don't bother. It's more trouble than it's worth. It's easier to get a small one that hasn't developed the super root system yet, and then it in the end will grow much bigger than that one you've worked really hard to transplant.
So Doug, I don't know in your book if you talk about problems that plague oaks. There's a question about oak wilt.
Yeah, a little bit. We have brought in a number of problems for oaks. In the West, we've got sudden oak death syndrome. We've got oak wilt in Ohio. We've got oak leaf scorch where I am. These are all diseases that have been moved around by humans, and they're terrible. I mean, they're challenging our oaks. I will say that the response, because I hear this, okay, I'm not going to plant oaks anymore because they'll get sick, or I'm not going to plant ashes, or I'm not going to plant chestnut, I'm not going to plant anything that has a disease. That means you're not going to plant anything. And that's not the solution. The solution is for us to find the resistant genotypes of all of our species that can handle these diseases. We do know that plants can survive these diseases because they do in other parts of the world. This through long periods of coevolution. But I know for oak leaf scorch, for example, on my property, I have a couple trees that have died. Others look great. Same place. I know they're exposed to the same disease, but they have some resistant genes. Those are the ones that are going to drop acorns. Those are the acorns that the blue jays are going to disperse, and that's how we develop resistance in an entire population. But if you stop planting them, you don't discover which genotypes are resistant or not. So yeah, these diseases are bad. Rather than trying to cure a disease on a particular tree, which is very difficult, it's better to keep planting and look for those resistant genotypes so that you don't have to worry about the disease anymore.
Okay, any quick hints on how to help very mature oaks stay healthy?
The key is to allow their root system to be unimpeded, which is really hard these days because they'll easily grow 300 feet from the center of the tree. So how many places can go 300 feet without hitting a foundation or a sewer line or a street? And that's what starts to lead to the problems. One of the big challenges, of course, is what happens when you get a gypsy moth invasion and it starts to defoliate it 2 or 3 times. That's something that needs to be addressed because they can take a couple of defoliations, but repeated defoliations on a big oak really can kill it, and you don't want that. So you'd have to deal with those uninvited guests. But I'm not an arbor guy. I know that a lot of tree experts like to prune out dead wood, and I do know that the very old oaks that I was talking about, the giants that are gone, almost always have hollow centers, which are really important features of an old oak. And a tree expert would come along and say, well, it's hollow inside, we have to take it down. No, you don't. The living portion is alive all the way around that tree, and it's still very stable. And the hollow part inside, that's where the raccoons live. That is home to an awful lot of things. Rare fungi only live in the hollow parts of big oak trees. So just the fact that they get hollow or have dead portions on them does not mean they're dying. Remember that 300 years of decline? That's 300 years, folks. And an awful lot of creatures use oaks as they're starting to decline. So if it's not right next to your house and no threat of falling down, be careful about what you prune out of there.
Great, thanks, Doug. Can we finish by having you teach us how to be squirrels? There were several questions about how do we plant acorns? How do they successfully grow? I've done the same thing. I've collected acorns from a lot of different places, have tried to, and I'm just not very successful. The squirrels do it better.
Yeah. Well, yes, squirrels are excellent at planting the trees. So were the blue jays. The trick is getting them through the winter without something eating them. And actually, I don't put things straight into the ground anymore. The one species of oak I don't have on our yard that should be here is post oak. One year I planted 100 post oak acorns and I got 0 because the mice got 100 post oak acorns. And there actually hasn't been a post oak mass since. But what I do now is I put it in a pot and I germinate it in a pot and then let it grow in the pot for a while. And for a while, I'm just talking about maybe 2 or 3 months. And then I transplant the potted tree. The big trick for the white oak group, remember they germinate in the fall. So you have to have them in the ground in the fall. And so they're in the pot in the ground, and keeping the mice out of your pot in the wintertime is a real challenge. You got to figure out ways to keep those mice out. And once you get past the period where the acorn is still attached to the tree, because that's what they're digging up and eating, then you're home free. But just putting them straight into the ground now has very low success rate. It really does.